All right. The consumer was a guest on Destiny Stream today. He is playing Triangle Strategy, a fantastic game. I am a huge fan of strategy role-playing games, so I was in his chat hitting him up a couple of times, and he pulled me in to talk, and I'm going to review our conversation. Starts out pretty standard, talking about video games and shit. We both like that, and then it moves into some more divisive topics, and I haven't watched it since I was there, and I was at work when it was happening, so I was pretty distracted. So I'm going to review my performance and see how well I communicated my ideas. I have a feeling it was not very well, but let's take a look.
Okay, that decoy is awesome. We have very different playstyles, so I can't really give advice. You're very aggressive, and when I play this game, I'm very passive. I kind of hang out in the back, and I use the card guy to drop people in.
Okay. Cool.
The decoy, I throw in the front.
Did you? Fuck, hold on. I need to figure out. I don't know if I can turn this down.
Yeah, that Switch audio.
Yeah, the Switch is always so loud.
Look at me talking how I'm always talking.
And is it best to mute your stream or to leave it running? Okay.
Oh, yeah, you should obviously mute the stream if you just asked that.
Yeah, it was confusing the hell out of me.
Yeah, I've never
that
been
decoy
on
chick,
someone
for the
else's
longest
stream
time, I thought
before.
she was trash because she does no damage, and so I didn't use her for most of this game until pretty close to the end. I started getting wrecked because I was playing the hardest difficulty like you, and that decoy is surprisingly good because it will draw in a hit, and it seems like for every one attack of theirs, it equals like 1.5 of yours. So if you can draw in one of their hits, it's a huge bonus, and it's kind of hard to notice that bonus at first.
Yeah, because like 1 or 2 hits, it seems like decides battles in this game it can. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So use that decoy a lot.
Yeah. Well,
Have you played a lot of hard strategy role-playing games like this, like Ogre Battle Tactics, or Rondio Swords, or Hoshigaima Tactics?
not really. I don't think I played FFT way back in the day, and I played. Have you ever heard of Final Fantasy Tactics 1.3?
Yeah, I've played all of those things.
Yeah.
FFT's got a couple of battles that are really hard, like the one where it blocks you off from your whole team, and you got to fight that brown knight dude.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the execution site.
Mhm.
And then there's that one other battle, but aside from those three, it's not exactly that difficult.
Yeah, I think I'd largely agree. I think the issue with Final Fantasy Tactics is that the enemies' levels didn't scale with your level in story battles, only in random battles. Although, I guess it was relatively. It can be kind of difficult to clear the whole. It's not called the Darkest Dungeon, the Deep Dungeon. I don't remember, but.
Yeah. The biggest problem with Final Fantasy Tactics, I commented earlier, is when you get.
A big part of why I was asking him if he's played difficult strategy games is in this game, he's very aggressive. The last match he was in for quite a while. I think he failed it like 4 times, and I cleared it first try. Not only because I'm better than him at strategy role-playing games, which I obviously am. I'm the fucking GOAT. But in this game, it's a little difficult, so passive strategy is more appropriate. Kind of hanging back, drawing enemies in, killing them one by one, having the guard guy go in front to take all the aggro, healing the guard guy, using the decoy, all that kind of stuff kind of synergizes extremely nicely. But he does pretty well. He's not a little bitch. He'll try over and over and over again until he gets it, which is great. I enjoy watching it, mostly because I love this kind of game. But I like watching someone else play the game because they play so differently than I do. It's nice to see someone else's playstyle.
Orlando and all those other Holy Knights.
Yeah,
you work so hard.
You can't use those.
Yeah, you work so hard to develop your character. So if you're playing that game for the first time and you throw those guys in, even if you turn them into summoners or anything like that, there's way overpowered.
Yeah.
That in conjunction with the
Aegis girl or Aegis, depending on how you pronounce her name or whatever. I think she's okay. She's like a holy knight, and she's not like her abilities aren't ultra overpowered. I think she's like fits nicely into a party. But yeah, Orlando is just fucking ridiculous. He's way too strong. That's like you could like send him out to like solo battles for random encounters and shit. It's insane.
Yeah, so that and the 6-member party member are like the 2 limitations of Final Fantasy Tactics. But I basically played every game in this genre, and Final Fantasy Tactics is.
When I say I basically played every game in the genre, it's probably 90% of the games that kind of fit this JRPG strategy role-playing game kind of feel. I played at least 90 to 95% of all of them in existence. So I do have a lot of expertise in this field.
Still the king, and I find that super odd. They've had so many years to improve on this genre, and nobody can beat Final Fantasy Tactics after 30 years.
You really think of all the games, you think Tactics is the best one of them all? Why do you think that?
Mostly the story. I really love Final Fantasy Tactics story. It's adult themed. It's paced extremely well, and just playing the game feels significant.
That's actually not the true answer. It was the answer I gave, but Final Fantasy Tactics is just so well-rounded in all aspects, not just the story. The story is strong. The story grips you, and it keeps you playing through it. But the job system is damn near perfect. The customization that you can do within your party is damn near perfect. The look, the feel, the art direction, the music, everything they do in that game is damn near perfect in Final Fantasy Tactics, and there hasn't been a game like it to surpass it. There's been some that are kind of close, like all the Fire Emblem series are similar to Tactics, but not quite. And so you can't really say that any of the Fire Emblems are superior to Final Fantasy Tactics because they're different. But this game here is technically like an exact continuation of Final Fantasy Tactics. It's even made by Square Enix, and it's not as good as Final Fantasy Tactics. Across the board, this game isn't as good as Final Fantasy Tactics, and it should be better. Final Fantasy Tactics was released in like 1998 or some shit. And they've had 20 years of development and game design to improve upon the Final Fantasy Tactics formula, and they have not done it.
Better than playing a lot of other games. Now there's another game called Fire Emblem Three Houses. It's paced very well, and it has a pretty good storyline, and it's engaging. And this game's storyline's pretty engaging too, but there's so many characters and there's so many side dialogues that you get a little distracted. It's a little heavy-handed on the side dialogue and on the characters.
Sure.
And you're going to be spending a lot of time in these mock battles if you want to keep all of your party members up to level. So what I did is I found a couple party members that I just chose to never use, so that way I didn't have to keep leveling them up. Because I think you get 40 characters.
Oh, Jesus, fuck, really?
Yeah, you just keep getting them. You just keep getting them. And by the end of the matches, I think you can have either 12 or 15 party members in each map.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 30, not 40, and you can get 15 members. It's too many characters. You end up benching half of your characters. It's a pretty big flaw in the game design, in my opinion, to give you that many characters, because they feel so useless. Now, maybe if there was permanent death in this, where they would die forever, you can use some of those characters, but I don't like to be given too many characters in these kind of games.
And for me, that's too much. Somewhere between 8 and 10 or 12 is like the perfect party count for these kind of games.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, otherwise you're just like standing on top of each other. It gets a little bit clusterfucky. Yeah.
Yeah, it gets a little bit clusterfucky, but this is a pretty good game. I like it a lot.
Did you play, oh god, does anybody remember the one that I played? The like indie Kickstarter one? Somebody
Is it that space one?
Space one? No, I don't think so.
Okay, yeah. There's a couple of space ones I don't like, and I don't like any of the XCOM. I don't like the XCOM
You don't like
formula.
XCOM?
No. The way they can shoot you when you travel from point A to point B, it's just off. I'm wrong. Like, I understand XCOM's a great game. My taste is off in this department.
Okay, that's fair. Oh, and I think it's a game called Fell Seal.
Oh, yeah, Fell Seal was promising, but ultimately trash.
Damn.
Yeah, I beat it. It had a lot of promise, but I'm excited for the next
Why do you think it was
iteration.
trash? The story?
The story was fine. It was just kind of janky. You could tell it was poorly made from a mechanic standpoint.
Okay.
And the character models were like awkwardly tall. It was
They were
fun.
very tall. Yeah. I thought it was an okay
yeah.
game, but yeah, I wasn't like super impressed. But
I gave it like 7.
okay.
Tactics being a 10.
Okay.
But again, I've played them all, so I rank my games as in how does it compare to other games, and things like Final Fantasy Tactics is better, Fire Emblem's better, all 3 Shining Forces are better.
There's a Shining Force 3? I didn't even know that. I only played 1 and 2.
Yeah, on the Sega Saturn. Only one of them came to America. The other 2 are Japanese, so way back, I'm 40, so I'm pretty old. Way back
Shining
in the
Force
day.
2 never came out in English, are you sure?
No, Shining Force 3 had 3 parts.
Oh.
2 of the parts, because the Sega Saturn and Sega as a company is just a terrible company, they never ported them over to America. So I had to buy the Japanese version and then print out English translations when I was like 17 or something like that.
Comment. No one believes I'm 40. I can't blame them, but...
Damn.
Yeah, Shining Force 3 is really good.
Oh, cool.
It's dated because the PS1 and the Saturn are like the first 3D graphics consoles, and so it's super dated and almost unplayable now because it's just so gross looking.
Wait, so what in the genre of games, what do you recommend the most? Obviously, if you've played Tactics, not that, but...
If you haven't played Ogre Battle, they just released a...
I played a game called Ogre Battle March of the Black Queen on Nintendo 64. Do you know that game?
Yeah, that game.
This dude just interrupted me. I was going to go through a long list of games he should play. Someone in the comment here has Symphony of War. I wouldn't recommend that one. It's good, but it's definitely not 10 out of 10 rivaling Final Fantasy Tactics area. But I was going to give them freaking... Obviously, Ogre Battle Tactics. And then I was going to recommend Fire Emblem Three Houses. And then I had one more really good one that I was going to recommend him, but I can't remember what it is at this moment. But Ogre Battle Tactics, if he liked Final Fantasy Tactics, is definitely the number 1 pick he should be playing. It's almost just as good as Final Fantasy Tactics. It's pretty great.
That game's pretty good.
Oh, okay. I was like, on it. Because I could be wrong, but I don't think you ever controlled your individual characters, right? Didn't they all kind of auto-battle or something? My memory is right. It's a long time.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. That one's not nearly as good as the...
Oh, yeah, a lot of handheld games are super good. You got Gen d'Arc, which was really good. That was on the PSP. And then you have my favorite Shinigami Tensei game, which is Devil Survivor. He should definitely play Devil Survivor. That game's excellent.
Tactics Ogre Weakling together. That came out just before Final Fantasy Tactics, so it's like the precursor to Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics is better because their job system's better, and
Tactics was really nicely fleshed out. The job system was cool. The abilities from other classes when you transferred was cool. The shops, the gear, the look of the game is really cool. Yeah, everything. Tactics is a really, really, really good game. It's like one of my top games of all time, I think.
same.
It also, I don't know if this is fair for me to say or not, but like, I feel like when I grew up, I feel like I got used to playing games that were like fairly mature and fairly dark. So like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy Tactics, Metal Gear Solid. Some of these games are like, I would say like fairly dark. Through and through. I think even the Shining Force kind of were. And some of the Fantasy Stars too. I feel like I went back recently, when I say recently, I mean like 3 years ago, and I tried to play Chrono Trigger. And that game felt very PG-13 to me. Am I crazy? Did I just not make it far enough? I don't even know if I said PG-13. I think like PG.
Yeah, you're not crazy. So Chrono Trigger is extremely nice for the artwork, the music, the look and feel of the game, and like the combat mechanics, and just like what it did with time travel and being able to complete it in multiple ways is very good. But in terms of having adult themes, it doesn't hold up. When I first played Final Fantasy VI, you have Celeste. She wants to kill herself through that entire game. And I played it first at like 13, and I didn't pick up on any of that. It wasn't until I played it when I was older that her and Locke is trying to convince her not to kill herself through most of that game. And I didn't pick up on any of those adult themes. So earlier you were talking about when you play a game determines how much you like a game.
Yeah.
And that's a very poignant point that you made there, because a lot of people, if they play something like Nier Automata and they don't understand humanity and philosophy, that game is going to be trash to them. They're not going to understand what's going on in the background of that game. They're going to see cyborg anime booties and their mind's going to stop there. It's not going to dig any deeper.
Sure. Okay.
It's a lot like listening to a Tool song. There's multiple layers on which you can interpret that Tool song depending on where you're at in your life. Yeah. You want to branch this conversation into a different line of talking?
Go for it. I don't know what else to say, so.
Okay. You're familiar with The Boy Who Cried Wolf, I'm sure, and there's two.
People loving my Tool take. I'll take that.
Kind of parallels within there. There's the obvious parallel being you shouldn't lie because false in one thing, false in all things. But then there's the other parallel of when do you trust a liar? How many times can someone be wrong before they are no longer trusted? So the people in the village of The Boy Who Cried Wolf didn't fire the guy who was hired to look for wolves, and he kept calling wolf. So the one time he calls for wolf, and then the wolves are actually there, the entire village loses their whole flock because they didn't trust the guy who called wolf. So you have companies like CNN and Fox that constantly lie, and CNN kind of looks at Fox and kind of checks Fox.
Okay, so the mentality behind this Boy Who Cried Wolf is I'm trying to get Destiny to a point where he's willing to acknowledge that the institutions which he loves so dearly have cried wolf so many times that it's difficult for the general public to believe them. And I'm going to weave this in multiple ways. I mostly wanted to talk about a conversation he had a long time ago with Tom Cruise, but then I didn't intend to, but it weaves into vaccinations and all of that stuff. I mostly just wanted to talk about his dismissal of Tom Cruise and use The Boy Who Cried Wolf as an allegory for that, and to talk about the secondary message of The Boy Who Cried Wolf.
Fox. It's kind of CNN's job to say Fox is lying here. It's kind of Fox's job to say.
Me listening to this, I obviously did a piss poor job of trying to explain what I was talking about.
CNN is lying here. And you had a conversation a long time ago about Tom Cruise and the pharmaceutical industry when he was on Matt Lauer acting like a fool, and you said that Tom Cruise was right. I forgot the analogy you used. It was a good analogy, but you said Tom Cruise is like a broken clock, essentially, that he constantly says that the pharmaceutical industry is wrong and they're doing evil stuff, and every now and then he's going to be right. But in this instance, he had a very specific claim that I feel might have actually been the boy crying wolf, and there was actually a wolf. He said that there was no chemical imbalance in the brain. That concept isn't real. And he looked at the research, and the research didn't prove that point. And then later on, like 20 years later, research is starting to support that claim that Tom Cruise made 20 years prior, that there is no chemical imbalance in the brain.
I think that my stance on that would be, the way that I would phrase this is, I would say there probably is a chemical imbalance, but when people talk about chemical imbalances in the brain, I think people are too keen to talk about a chemical imbalance like a biological deformity that is like hard set. So like people will say a chemical imbalance in the brain is like having a 6th or 7th finger, whereas I think the chemicals in your brain are constantly changing, right? So like when you have an orgasm, that causes a quote-unquote chemical imbalance in the brain, or when you sleep in too much, that causes a quote-unquote chemical imbalance in the brain. So I would guess that like mental illnesses probably result in.
I don't like his phrasing there. An imbalance is not to say that it's high or low. It's to say that the average is out of whack. So when you have an orgasm, your body is flooded with chemicals, but that's within the normal realm and spectrum of human body behavior. Everybody's body is flooded with chemicals during an orgasm, so it's not really a chemical imbalance. It's just a spike of chemicals, but that's normal for the human body. When the pharmaceutical industry was doing those initial studies saying there's a chemical imbalance in the body, they were trying to make the claim that people have serotonin at higher levels or lower levels at all times, and that is the cause of things like depression and all that kind of stuff. And Tom Cruise was saying that the research doesn't support that claim, and he was pretty specific. Normally, I would just ignore Tom Cruise and any idiot from all of the Scientology department, but his specificness of the claim that there is no chemical imbalance in the brain. I looked at the research, and the research doesn't prove that there's a chemical imbalance in the brain. That's a kind of a specific claim and a specific critique of the chemical imbalance conversation. And for him to be that specific and saying, I read research, it claims this, it's not true, and then like 20 years later, some evidence to suggest that what Tom Cruise was saying is actually correct, kind of plays into The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Tom Cruise being the boy who cried wolf, constantly saying the pharmaceutical industry does blah, 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 blah. But in this instance, Tom Cruise was probably correct. And I don't know if Tom Cruise was correct because he's always just shitting on the pharmaceutical industry, or if Tom Cruise was correct because they did faulty studies to prove a chemical imbalance, to attempt to prove a chemical imbalance in the brain, and then the FDA didn't catch it. None of these peer-reviewed studies caught it, but yet Scientology and Tom Cruise caught it.
In or result from different kinds of chemical imbalances, but these are very malleable based on your like daily behavior. They're not like hard set in stone, you know. So I'm guessing Tom Cruise would probably agree with that. When he says there's not a chemical imbalance in the brain, what he probably means, and what I would interpret it as, or what I would hope so, and what I would say is that there might be behaviors or environmental causes or diet things or whatever that are causing your brain neurochemicals to be a little bit off, and you should probably do what you can within your environment to change that, without relying on necessarily like a drug to do it.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, recent research and everything I've seen, I felt a little cautious saying this, but like I don't really know right now how I actually feel about like SSRIs. Like whereas before I'd always say, listen, you should do it. It doesn't help that much, but like at least a little bit plus therapy is good. I'm a lot more on the fence, even like recommending them at all now. To where if a friend tells me like, oh yeah, like I went to a therapist, I think I'm gonna get on SSRIs, like I would usually encourage like you should really exhaust every single option before heading down that route, because it's a scary route to get locked down. But yeah.
See, and this is what makes Destiny probably the best streamer on the left. Now, I don't really exist on the left or the right, but a lot of these leftist streamers just bother the hell out of me because they're so stupid and stuck in their ways. Where Destiny, he's a little stuck in his ways with his propensity to trust authority figures and to trust large institutions. But he's able to see through quite a bit of bullshit, and he's able to assess situations outside of his pigeonholed social group. So he's on the left, but he can identify things that go against the left narrative and point them out. The most popular one is his Kyle Rittenhouse take. He's on the left. Everyone on the left hated Kyle Rittenhouse. They thought he was in the wrong because the left narrative machine was against Kyle Rittenhouse. But Destiny was able to independently view that situation and say he was in the right. He defended himself against people that were trying to harm him, and he's innocent. And his nuanced take there was refreshing, and that's kind of how I got to know Destiny as a streamer. And then he was able to spot out the bullshit in the Central Park Karen. He was able to spot out the bullshit with that pregnant girl who just got assaulted, pseudo-assaulted by 5 different people in New York. She rented out a bike, and then the 5 people tried to steal her bike. And he watched the video, and every other leftist who watched that video was saying that this 6-month pregnant woman was trying to steal a bike from 5 adult males. No 6-month woman is ever going to try to steal a bike from 5 adult males. And because the left narrative was that these 5 adult males were in the right and this white woman was just a Karen, that she was in the wrong, and they just turned their brains off completely. Destiny was able to watch that video and ascertain that the narrative that was being pushed on the left was inaccurate. So I like him for that reason. I think he's very good faith. He moderately intelligent. Definitely more intelligent than someone like Lasan, or in my opinion, more intelligent than David Pakman or anyone over at the Young Turks. He's a good source to go to for the left. He's like a left leaning role model, in my opinion, one that I can actually get behind and support. I don't agree with about 20% of his takes, but about 80% we align on. And I was, throwing him a little bit of love because he was playing this strategy role-playing game, and I kind of like his takes as someone on the left, because I kind of view myself as more on the left than on the right. But there's so many people that are so far left, and their brains are just gone. They're unable to use their brains to think critically, and he's still able to use his brain.
Agree with your take there. I'm not an expert in this topic, and I don't pretend to be. But
I do.
going back to
Pretend to be.
yeah,
I'm just kidding, go
yeah,
ahead.
going back to the boy who cried wolves. Scientology constantly cries wolves about the pharmaceutical industry. But if the pharmaceutical industry messes up, if they have some type of error where they mess up, the CDC is not really in a position to
And the whole time I'm saying CDC, I mean FDA, but I kind of get CDC, NIH, and FDA all confused. He correctly points it out later on, I believe.
properly monitor large pharmaceutical organizations like Pfizer or anything like that, because they take such large paychecks from those pharmaceutical industry. So it's going to be a terrible situation.
I don't know if I would agree with that. The CDC takes large paychecks. I don't know if this is necessarily like a huge bill.
This is my fault. It's terrible wording. Paychecks, really? I meant to say that they get money from pharmaceutical industries. I shouldn't have said paychecks. God.
I like your point, but I don't think I would agree with that, but go ahead.
I could be wrong, but from what I've read, about 40% of all of the CDC's revenue comes from fees that they charge pharmaceutical industries to get their medications approved.
Sure. So while that might be true, that's markedly different than because the other thing kind of sounded like, oh, they're just paying them off or whatever. Also, I mean, the CDC.
Yeah, he's right. I phrased that terribly.
He's an executive branch agency. I mean, they could raise government funding if they needed, but yeah, I'm sure they charge fees too. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just under the assumption that if you're paying someone to approve your drugs and they're taking paychecks from you, it's a compromise of integrity there. Now, whether or not that has an impact on any pharmaceuticals, I can't answer that question. But just from a high top level, if company A is being overwatched by company B and company A is paying company B, then for me, there's a conflict of interest there.
Yeah, I could see that kind of being the case. I think some fee is probably important, right? Otherwise, you could have a million companies that are all just trying to get drugs faster or whatever, wasting the CDC's time. So
yeah,
that's some fee, some sort of price volume is probably important. Yeah, and then the second thing would be is the CDC reliant on these funds to operate? Because my understanding is that as an executive agency, they could always raise money from the government, right, if they needed to. But
yeah, it's highly possible that it's just greedy pigs within the organization taking extra cash.
Greedy pigs. That was a bad phrase. I just meant that when I say greedy pigs, I mean they're trying to balloon up their organization. They're trying to eat. They're trying to become as big and as powerful of an organization as possible. And this happens in all corporations and governmental bodies. They do try to take in as many resources as possible and balloon the size of their organization as much as possible. The FDA is trying to become the biggest organization it can be by taking in as much revenue and hiring as many people and just becoming this powerhouse within there. And that's a struggle within all government organizations, which is why government never shrinks. Every organization within the government seeks to expand itself, to give itself more power, to give itself more authority, to give itself more governmental funding. The FBI does it. The CIA does it. Democrats do it. Republicans do it. FDA does it. Everybody does it. They're seeking to expand their power through size and currency.
And that they're still doing their job perfectly fine. I can't prove that.
Well, also, hold on. It's important. Sorry, we have to get really into the weeds on some of these. When we say greedy pigs taking money, the CDC fee structure, it's not like the money's being paid to people working in the CDC, right? Like, you don't get a huge cash bonus for approving a drug or something, do you?
So that's only partly correct. It's not being paid directly to people as in bonuses, but when the CDC takes in 40% of their money from the pharmaceutical industry, that 40% of that money is allowing them to expand the FDA, not the CDC. I'm going to say the CDC all the time because I like zombies and the CDC's and The Walking Dead, and the CDC is more popular than the FDA in terms of this type of communication. But the FDA is getting 40% more money than they otherwise would have, so they're able to hire more people, they're able to balloon their organization up, and they are able to pay people more. Dr. Fauci is the highest paid government employee. Part of that salary does come from the pharmaceutical industry.
No, but you can expand your organization. So within the government, every governmental organization, one of their prime objective is to expand their own organization. More people, more money, more resources. So just kind of ballooning up their organization with those fees. So
I'm sure that can happen, but I don't know if I'd say that's a primary goal. Right? If that was the case, I feel like we would have expanded the IRS so long ago. But that organization has been kept so small compared to what it probably should be. Although I don't know if you would agree that you sound a little libertarian, so maybe we would fight on that point. But I mean, I know agencies want to expand, but I mean, those are fights you have to have in Congress for that now.
Yeah, you would win that argument. I think the IRS is heavily underfunded, but I don't support funding the IRS simply because I don't believe as an organization they have the ability to target the proper targets.
Okay.
If you fund the IRS more middle-class people and people kind of inching into wealth like yourself are probably going to be the ones they target. They're not going to target the proper targets, which is corporations subverting the entire tax system through loopholes. And no one's going to address those loopholes. Trump
Well,
didn't.
we got to be careful. Like, it's not the IRS. The IRS's job is enforcement of the tax code. It's not to like rewrite the tax code or to break people that aren't breaking the rules or whatever, right? Like,
See, I didn't phrase this very well. So the IRS has an inability to tax the proper people, which is large corporations that are basically circumventing all of the tax policy legally through loopholes. And since the IRS has no ability to close those loopholes, when the IRS gets additional funding and the IRS gets additional employees, one, it's going to balloon up the IRS like most government organizations do. But two, they're not going to go after the people that will be the most beneficial people to go after. They're going to go after the little guy. If you get 10,000 more IRS employees, those 10,000 IRS employees are all going to be targeting small businesses and people that make between like $200,000 a year and $1 million, maybe even $5 million. Those are the people that are going to be targeted by the IRS. And I don't think those are the people that we really need to go after from the IRS. So if we want to improve the IRS, we have to improve the tax code, but there's no way the tax code's ever going to get improved because powerful organizations fund the government to keep those tax codes, those tax loopholes in place. So expanding the IRS is not a good thing because they cannot go after the targets that they should go after. Don't think I communicated that very well here.
like the IRS
correct.
shouldn't be busting people using quote unquote loopholes, because loopholes are, you're implying that it's a legal method of tax avoidance, right?
Yeah. So because of all the legal methods of tax avoidance, expanding the IRS is primarily going to target people that I view should not be targeted by the IRS. Regular mom and pops doing their small businesses that are probably skimming taxes a little bit, and they will get caught with more IRS agents, and the IRS will get more income and revenue. But I don't really feel that those people should be getting targeted by the IRS, because obviously taxes are a little bit unfair in America, and that would be my only pushback on there.
Gotcha. I would disagree with all of this, but you can keep going. I don't think we're to fight on every. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're probably 80% aligned and 20% disaligned from what I've seen of your show. I mostly watch it at 2.0 speed after the fact.
Gotcha.
I think you're a little too trusting in organizations, and you could very well be right, and I could be wrong. But for instance, like Pfizer holds the record for largest monetary penalty for a drug they produced that killed a bunch of people.
Which drug was that?
And oh man,
Oh, I don't need the name. I'm just curious, like, what, do you know what kind of drug it was or whatever? I just haven't heard about it.
it was Bextria, I believe, Bextra,
Gotcha,
and that
gotcha.
was from Pfizer, and they hold the record for penalty. So obviously the FDA did their job in saying this drug is now killing people, but they also approved that drug.
Sure.
But going back to the Boy Who Cried Wolf, it would be a sad state if Scientology is accurate in pushing back against the pharmaceutical industry, because Scientology should be the last place anyone goes to for truth or reason or logic. And if Tom Cruise actually...
So here's that drug I was talking about. It killed a bunch of people. FDA approved it. It didn't get caught. So what I'm trying to do by pointing out this drug is to show, one, that Pfizer has lied and cheated for profits. They've been proven to lie and cheat for profits in the past. And since they've been proven to lie and cheat for profits and hold the record for largest penalty for lying and cheating and killing people, Pfizer should definitely not be trusted. And Destiny didn't trust Tom Cruise because Tom Cruise is a Scientologist who constantly yells about the pharmaceutical industry. And he didn't trust Tom Cruise because Tom Cruise was wrong and was lying, not necessarily lying, but is constantly talking about the pharmaceutical industry. But he does trust Pfizer, who has been legally guilty of lying for profits and for revenues. So his ability to, he doesn't trust Pfizer. I'm mischaracterizing him again. But his ability to openly trust the process, which allows Pfizer to create a vaccination and then release to market, I believe is a little over lenient. I think he's a little too trusting in both the FDA and Pfizer's ability to produce drugs that are safe for the U.S. population. I'm trying to get to that point. I'm trying to get him in that area. Just so he can maybe see that he's a little too trusting in this department. I think I ultimately failed.
was right. If Scientology, because they probably put a lot of resources into finding their enemy's weak points, and their enemy is the pharmaceutical industry. So what if Scientology actually found a legitimate weak point in that chemical imbalance, which was largely used to push SSRIs? What if Scientology was right and Tom Cruise was correct, that he read the research, and in that research they were wrong, and every other institution missed it?
I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be that surprising. I tend to look at like, well, where do the incentives lie for Scientology? Like, we're pushing a lot on like Scientology being correct here, but
And right here, he laid a trap for me to get him, and I don't think I got him very much. I'll have to re-listen. It's been like an hour or so since this aired. Since I did
every
this
single
conversation.
like alternative medicine system would also be right? Like acupuncturists, chiropractors, Ayurvedic.
And he's wrong here because Tom Cruise made a specific claim, and I'm just assuming that Tom Cruise's claim comes from Scientology. So Scientology looked at a lot of the research, or at least they claim they looked at the research, and after looking at the research, they came to the conclusion that there wasn't enough evidence to support the claim that there is such thing as chemical imbalance. That's a pretty specific claim, so acupuncture didn't make that claim, so he's a little wrong, and I think he corrects himself here.
Medicines, like all of those people would also be correct too, not just Scientology. It's not like they found something novel or something that nobody else discovered, right?
Well, that's kind of where my point was going with Tom Cruise's specificness of the claim. It's not ultra specific. It's kind of broad, saying that the specific claim of chemical imbalance in the brain was incorrect.
Sure.
But
To be
it
fair,
is a
I mean,
little-
like, it is fairly specific, I guess, yeah. But to be fair, like, it's always been, like, the serotonin idea of depression has always been relatively contentious. Like, it's been something that has been very, very, very heavily researched. And I want to say, wasn't it last year a really big study was published that super challenged the idea that it even had to do with serotonin imbalance for depression? I thought that was a really big thing that came out last year. I'd have to look again.
Yeah, I believe you're correct. And the human brain is so odd, and it's the least understood thing in the entire medical field. People seem, I'm sure you've heard, but when people win the lottery, they're only happy for about a week, and then they seem to bounce back to whatever that base level of happiness that they have is.
We acclimate very quickly to bad and good things. I was surprised, even for people that get like crippled and like lose loss of leg and limb and shit, they can still report like being pretty happy like a few weeks later. Like they catch up like very quickly. It's pretty crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I've always been a happy person my entire life, and when I was 21, I got kidney failure,
Jesus.
and I was in dialysis, having a blast, playing my DS, playing a bunch of strategy role-playing games while I had these IVs hooked in my arm to filter my blood, and I was totally fine and happy. Where other people, if they got kidney failure at the age of 21, probably would have went into some type of depressive situation, and trying to attribute that to some type of chemical balance in the brain, I imagine, is going to be a nearly impossible task. And then when you take things like SSRIs, or let's just use Ritalin to use a name, I think Ritalin will work on most people regardless of whether they have ADD or a chemical imbalance.
Sure. I mean, we've seen that with amphetamines in general. They give people great concentration, right?
Yeah. So how are we going to test whether or not those are effective if they're always going to work?
So the objective of me bringing this point up is that the pharmaceutical industry pushed a narrative of chemical imbalance to then sell drugs for profits. And the FDA was complicit in that push for those drugs. I guess the FDA is mostly testing for safety of those drugs. But because of the pharmaceutical industry pushing the chemical imbalance, they were able to push out these SSRIs to huge percentages of the population and get a bunch of kids addicted to Ritalin. Now, I believe this is an overall net harm to society. Not a lot. I'm not like super anti-drug, but I don't think we should be prescribing all these kids the Ritalin at the levels they're currently subscribed at. And if we took 1,000 people with diagnosed ADD, there's a spectrum of how much ADD do you have. I believe if there's 1,000 people with ADD, only 1 or 2 out of that 1,000 actually have ADD to the level that necessitates a Ritalin prescription. And the FDA is complicit in that. Pharmaceutical industry is complicit in that. So I'm trying to build the narrative that the FDA is not to be fully trusted. The pharmaceutical industry is not to be fully trusted. And I don't think I do a very good job of it.
Well, I think the idea is the challenging part is you have to establish some sort of baseline, and then from the baseline we try to figure out like where people should be. So there's like a baseline we expect for people to be attentive or to have executive function control or whatever, and the people that fall beneath that baseline we medicate up to what we imagine the baseline to be, right?
Yeah, and do you think the pharmaceutical industries are doing the proper testing to identify people's like happiness baseline and the impact of those drugs after the baseline, or do you think they're just looking for the end result, which is an improvement in focus and or happiness?
Well, they're looking for the improvement, right?
Yeah, and if that improvement always happens, I'm not necessarily against Ritalin or any of those drugs, but if the improvement always happens, I think it might be a false corollary to say that Ritalin is a drug that is designed specifically to help something like ADHD.
Well, I don't know if I would say it's designed specifically to help ADHD, right? It's just something that improves focus, and people with ADHD need like improve.
Yeah, that was a misspeak on my part. I didn't mean to say specifically designed to help ADHD. I meant to say specifically prescribed to help ADHD.
Focus, right?
Yeah, says the current literature.
Yeah, according to yeah.
Yeah, and your take on the CDC is probably pretty accurate, and it was very similar to your take on the WikiLeaks within Twitter. A lot of people on the right were pretty stupid to try to jump down the government's throat for paying Twitter. But obviously, as you said, and you were completely correct in this matter, if you're going to request a company do a job for you, do a task for you, you have to compensate them. So I don't think there was any malfeasance in the government paying Twitter to look at their specific request.
Sure.
Now, I didn't want to bring up this topic because we're already on the pharmaceutical thing. I'm trying to hammer this point home, and I don't want to go into the whole Twitter thing. But that is correct. I don't think Twitter was in the wrong at all for charging the government to handle the government's request. That just makes perfect sense. Government request XYZ get looked at and possibly censored. Twitter's like, that's going to take man hours. We got to charge you for it. There was malfeasance on the government side. The government should not be going to Twitter saying, you need to remove this stuff because that's a direct violation of the First Amendment. Now, if it's breaking the law, sure, the government should be able to do that. But I don't think Destiny mischaracterizes the Twitter leaks, which I, in the video called WikiLeaks, he mischaracterizes the Twitter leaks as only Hunter Biden's cock. And even if it was only Hunter Biden's cock, the government has no role to say this non-political figure, this person who is not in politics, he doesn't hold a public office, his nudes have leaked, and we want this company to censor people that release these nudes. There's thousands of people out there who get their nudes leaked, and it's not the government's job to censor organizations that are showing those nudes. I think I remember seeing Megyn Kelly get a bunch of nudes leaked of her. Government didn't step in to try to censor the places that were leaking her nudes. So it's not the government's job to tell corporations what they can and cannot do. Corporations are perfectly within their right to accept money from the government to censor things because the corporations are not upheld by the First Amendment. That's the government. So the government was the big problem with the Twitter files, and Destiny is pretty intelligent with his debating abilities that he kept the government out of all of his debates on the Twitter files, and he focused purely on Twitter, and he pretty much slaughtered anyone who tried to debate him because he focused on whether Twitter was in the wrong and not so much whether the government was in the wrong, because the government was definitely in the wrong. And anytime he was debating people, he would pivot away from the government and bring it back to Twitter, and then people would fall for that and try to claim that Twitter did something wrong. But Twitter did nothing wrong. Twitter is a company. They wanted to make money. They were totally fine censoring things for a paycheck, and that's what corporations do. The government was, in fact, in the wrong. But I didn't want to bring any of that up. I'm kind of trying to keep the conversation light, build some goodwill here, agree with them on some points, so I can move into the next argument topics, or next topic, I guess.
And that's kind of similar with the CDC taking pay cuts or paybacks or whatever you want to call them, taking fees for being able to approve medical drugs. Because Pfizer could dump out 30 different drugs in a single month if they really wanted to, but then they have to pay for all 30 of those drugs to get looked at.
Sure, yeah, and they wouldn't be able to pass the... Also, it's not the CDC, it's the FDA that does approvals for drugs finally, right? They probably wouldn't be able to get all those drugs through, right?
Yeah. I kind of lump them all together. I don't know exactly the role difference between the FDA, the CDC, and the NIH. They all kind of overlap a little bit.
I mean, maybe similar-ish missions, but the final approval for drugs, like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, all goes. Those are the FDA processes, right?
Yeah, I guess Food and Drug Administration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was kind of saying they all kind of overlap because I think Anthony Fauci is the head of the NIH, and he was the figurehead for all of it. And so when it's talking about the FDA's approval over these vaccinations, that all kind of got the spotlight under Fauci. So I kind of just put them all. I kept saying CDC. I should have just said FDA.
Yeah. So the false in one thing, false in all things. I think it's a pretty big problem within this society because I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I have a little bit of knowledge about a lot of stuff, but not a lot of knowledge on any particular topic. And I find the news to be inaccurate so frequently about topics, just constantly inaccurate about topics. So I distrust them for that reason alone. But obviously they're going to be right about a lot of different stuff. Like, what do you think would be a solution forward to...
Oh, man, I worded that poorly, too. Jesus, I'm awful. So I brought up I'm a jack of all trades and the news because when I watch the news and they talk about a topic that I'm familiar with, let's just say like computer hacking or computer coding, they're wrong. I am more of an expert than the news is in this topic, and I'm able to point out, man, you're talking out of your ass. You have absolutely no clue what you're fucking talking about. But then when they talk about a separate topic that I'm not an expert on, let's say they're talking about the veterinarian industry. They're talking about vets, and I know nothing about the veterinarian industry. When I read that news story, listen to that news article, I'm kind of like nodding my head like, oh, yeah, that's true. They're telling the truth, but I have very high evidence that the news is often wrong because I am a jack of all trades. I know a lot about a lot of different things, and the news is almost always wrong when they talk about a story, at least to some degree, and usually it's a very large degree. So when they talk about these stories and they're wrong, when I know about it, I can point it out. But when they talk about topics that I don't know about, I kind of give them the benefit of the doubt that they're right. And I think a lot of people do that. So a lot of people have very narrow knowledge. So when they hear these news stories, they tend to believe it because it's not a topic they're expert on. But if the news story covers a topic that they're an expert on, they'll be like, well, that's not true. Let's say there's a carpenter out there, and then the news starts talking about carpentry. That carpenter is going to be like, oh, that's a bullshit story. I'm a carpenter. Everything you're saying is wrong. But then the next story is about human trafficking, which that carpenter knows nothing about. Then he's like, oh, yeah, I saw this story about human trafficking. And he assumes it's true because he doesn't have that knowledge. And I did a piss poor job communicating the reason I brought up the jack of all trades, and it just kind of makes me look like an idiot here.
To alleviate the problem of false in one thing, false in all things.
I mean, like I said, I kind of say like you have to see where like the incentives lie, because that'll usually tell you more often than not what people are lying about or why people are lying is what are they incentivized to lie about.
And I'm so glad he said this. He put himself in a trap. I was unable to execute on the trap that he just put himself in, talking about the incentives. I was trying to get there the whole time, but I'll cover that after he talks a little bit more.
So for instance, if somebody, if you ask a kid, for instance, like, did they stay up late last night playing video games? Are they going to lie to you? Well, the incentive is there for them to lie because it sounds like they're going to get in trouble if they say yes. But if you ask a kid, like, did you eat breakfast? Or maybe an innocuous question, did you see Frank today at school? Maybe they're less likely to lie because the incentive is not there for the lie to happen. So I think looking at like what people are incentivized to say, what the rewards or punishments are behind certain answers, can give you somewhat of an indication of how reliable a statement might be. That's why one of the things that frustrates me a lot is people say mainstream media lies, and they'll say that all the time, and they'll say they're paid off to sell you like a certain opinion, or they're something like that. And I always challenge people, because alternative media is also heavily incentivized to lie too, because the more sensational you are and the more you can contradict mainstream media, the more payments you get for it. You collect rents for that kind of, right? Like
I love that response, but how do you
right here, I got an IM from my boss at work. Obviously, I'm slacking off, but I was running a very long query, and it was starting to time out, and he was like IMing me, hey, your query's timing out. Anyways, so I got very distracted right here, which sucks because this is exactly where I wanted to hit him at. And then I got stuck on the word, how do you reconcile the idea of incentives with the pharmaceutical industry, but I couldn't come up with the word reconcile, and it just wrecked my brain, and I flubbed it right here.
I don't know the word. That response in relation to Pfizer and the jab, they have tons of incentive to lie about the performance of their vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
So the incentives are all there. So why are you so willing to trust Pfizer with the vaccine when their incentives are to lie?
Yeah, so the ideal is that, like, I'm not trusting Pfizer, I'm trusting the peer review process and the government, because those are supposed to be the two big checks on their behavior.
Yeah, and you're probably correct in all of that. I have my own, as I said, I had kidney failure, so I did a whole lot of research on why I didn't get vaccinated, and it has nothing to do with the reasons.
Oh man, I totally dropped it. So the incentive structures are all over the place for them to bullshit the COVID vaccination effectiveness. So Pfizer took upfront money from the government, and then they were going to get money when they sold the vaccination. So they were double dipping on their revenue for the vaccination. So Pfizer had to produce a vaccination in order to get that second dip of revenue. So their incentive to produce a vaccination that is effective is ultra high, so high that they're willing to lie about it. They've proven they're willing to lie about it because they've lied about other drugs that have killed people, and they've gotten caught. So they're red-handedly willing to lie and put human lives on the table. They don't give a fuck if they kill people, only if they make money. That is Pfizer's objective. So they're totally willing to lie, and the FDA is totally capable of missing it and allowing it to hit the population. The FDA is highly incentivized to allow Pfizer to lie because they're getting 40% of their revenue from the fees from Pfizer. But on top of that, in governmental organizations, when they make a decision, one of the worst things for them is to go back on that decision. If you know anything about the U.S. legal system, there's a concept called precedent. And the legal system is totally based on precedent. Like, for instance, Roe v. Wade was a legal precedent that other lawyers and judges would have referenced as the precedent. What do we do in this scenario? Oh, let's look back at previous court cases and get the precedent off of those previous court cases. So when the FDA approves a drug, that sets the precedent of that drug being effective, and the last thing the FDA wants to do is to revoke that drug and to say, we messed up, this drug is not good, So there's a heavy incentive for the FDA to go along with it after they gave emergency approval. Now, the Johnson & Johnson vaccination, they approved it under the Emergency Approval Authorization Act or whatever that was, and it hit the global market. And they should have revoked that as soon as they started seeing blood clots, but they didn't. And the reason they didn't is they don't like to go back on their approvals. When they say something is good, they like to ride that out. And ideally for the FDA, they would have liked to ride out the Johnson & Johnson, let the people die, and then eventually, it just get swept under the rug so they don't have to revoke it. But eventually it got so bad that they did have to revoke the Johnson & Johnson vaccination. I think it was for people under the age of 18. And eventually I think they revoked the entire vaccination from Johnson & Johnson because it was causing blood clots and it was causing people to get harmed after they approved it. But because the FDA has so many incentives to not go back on their current standing, on their approvals, that getting a drug off the market is actually pretty difficult once it's been approved by the FDA. And the FDA circumvented a lot of their regular processes because of the emergency authorization that they were able to give these vaccinations. So there's incentive structures all over the place for this to not be valid. Now, Pfizer claimed that there was a 95% prevention of spread at the beginning of their vaccine trials. That is a lie. If you look at the data, it is a lie, because if it was a 95% chance of stopping the spread, places like Seattle had 90% adherence, 90+% adherence to the vaccination guidelines. 90% of people in Seattle got vaccinated. And if it's 95% effective at stopping the spread and 90% of people got the vaccination, it would have stopped it outright. It would have completely stopped it, and it didn't, because Pfizer lied. They straight up lied, and the FDA was complicit in that lie. Now, they've had to pivot their message because of that lie, and they pivoted that message multiple times throughout this, and the FDA was complicit in that lie.
Everybody else didn't get vaccinated. Mine are completely separate and different. So
Oh, and on top of that, when you look at the vaccination rates in America, they're extremely high. I think more than 70 people got vaccinated. So Pfizer's initial claim that it was 95% effective at stopping the spread was absolutely wrong. That is categorically wrong. So Pfizer lied to the entire public, and even after that lie, people are just kind of okay with going about it. And the FDA was a part of that lie.
I'd like to hold myself a little bit above the anti-vaccine crowd in that regard. But I lost my train of thought on where I was going with that.
Sure.
Because I didn't really want to talk about vaccinations. I mostly wanted to talk about the Boys Who Cried Wolf and the...
Well, I
Boston
guess I'm
Brunswick Fall.
curious about that. Especially, I'm guessing you're somewhat immunocompromised then, or no? Or
Yeah, I got a kidney transplant from my sister who would take immunosuppressant
suppressants.
medication.
Yeah, so that your body
Yeah.
doesn't, until it rejects a kidney.
And my body doesn't reject it. So in order for the vaccination to work, it has to trigger an immune response within your body. And people that are immunocompromised have a lower chance of the vaccination actually being effective. But all of the risk factors of the vaccination are still present.
Sure,
And
but
those
are you
risk
not worried
factors-
about the risk factors of actually getting SARS-CoV-2, of getting COVID-19, of, I don't know what it was variant we're on?
No, I work from home and I don't leave. If
Okay,
I
that's
was
fair.
if I was in a service industry job, I probably would have gotten vaccinated. But I am a business intelligence analyst. I work from home. I rarely leave the house. I love staying dormant in my little crab cave, and so I don't have a high level of exposure. And I got COVID from my wife in December for the first time, and it was obviously the more mutated COVID, so it wasn't as strong as the initial COVID. And I was better in like a day. It didn't really impact me. But I do everything from my own sort of logic, and it doesn't always work. My logic is obviously flawed sometimes, as is everybody's. But the most ideal situation for my current circumstance would have been not to catch COVID and not to get vaccination. So I was shooting for that ideal outcome, which is no risk from the vaccination, no risk from COVID. Just by not catching COVID, not getting vaccinated. And then the next lower possible outcome is getting vaccinated, not getting COVID. And then for me, the worst solution would be getting vaccinated and getting COVID, because that would have been a double dip inside of the risk category.
Well, not necessarily. I think the order of risks are your biggest risk is no vax, then COVID. Your second biggest risk is vax and COVID. And then your third risk is just vaccinated, right? And then your fourth risk would be doing nothing.
I think we'll just slightly disagree on that risk.
Unless you believe
matrix.
that unless you think that the vaccine is ineffective at staving off any of the more serious medical conditions or complications or hospitalization, I guess.
I work with data a lot, and I'm not an expert on how they measured, because one of their big claims, first they said that it was like 95% effective, and it might have been for
Oh, I did go into some of the 95% effective. Let's see how well I do with communicating this idea.
like the first couple of weeks of COVID, and then it dropped off heavily. So the COVID vaccination wasn't that effective in the later years of COVID. So then they
hold on,
pivoted.
wait, real quick, just to clarify these. So it might not have been effective at getting you not getting the disease. My understanding is even in the later stages of whatever we're in right now is highly effective in preventing hospitalization, is what it's generally recommended, I think. But go ahead.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing I want to talk about is the measurement. So they pivoted to the phrase greatly reduces hospitalization and death, I believe is how they phrase that. But I'm not sure they have the data points in place to actually measure the impact of COVID for a vax person and a non-vax person, how sick they get. How do you measure how sick someone gets in COVID in a valid, data-centric manner?
I thought the sickness was just how likely were they to have to go to the hospital once contracting COVID.
Yeah, I mean, that could have been their measurement, but then every hospital counts that stuff differently, and every state reports that stuff differently.
Well, the counting will be
familiar.
like, are you in the hospital? Do you have COVID, right? And then how many people tested positive that didn't go to the hospital? Like, I think that if you, because my understanding was, I don't have the studies offhand, but my understanding is that when you, like, I'm just throwing out bullshit numbers, but like, let's say like 80% of the population in the United States is vaccinated. When you look at the people that were being hospitalized, it would be like 20% of them were vaccinated. So the people that were going to the hospital were much more likely to be unvaccinated than the average population, is my understanding.
Yeah, that's the understanding that the pharmaceutical industries put out because they were primarily involved with setting up those research studies and stuff like that. And they have a big incentive for that vaccination to continue working, even though it didn't stop the spread. I'm not going down like a conspiratorial mindset. It's just that the incentives exist for Pfizer to lie about their pharmaceutical effectiveness of their medication.
Yeah, and I agree with that. That's why we have the FDA. That's why we have peer review.
See, I let him slide. I let him slide with this. The FDA and the peer review are both compromised as well because the FDA is taking pay. 40% of its about 40% of its revenue is coming from pharmaceutical industries, and they don't want to backtrack on their approval of the vaccination. So Pfizer lied about the 95% effectiveness. The proper response from the FDA would have been to reevaluate, retest, and show what that was. But they didn't have the time or the resources, and they didn't want to backtrack on their initial decision. So the FDA is highly compromised in the vaccination. And what I was trying to point out is that the data available for the claim that it greatly reduces death and hospitalization, and I think they even include serious illness, that data is not available. That data is not collected properly. There's no controls in place for collecting that data. So if you go to the John Hopkins up in Seattle, and then you go to John Bopkins in Texas, the way they collect the data on their COVID is completely different. And the way states collected COVID data is completely different. So every time you look at COVID data, it's a bunch of apples and oranges slapped together. And unfortunately, it's the best we have. It's the best data we have. But using bad data always results in bad decision making. And the COVID data is bad data. It's the best we have, but it is bad data. Their collection methods were not in place. They didn't do a good job with collecting. And when someone goes into the hospital with COVID, hospitals were actually getting a bit of a government money for each time they had a COVID patient to try to alleviate the effect of COVID on the hospitals. So they were throwing COVID on all kinds of stuff. And I don't think that the hospitals are anywhere near equipped to handle the data to accurately represent whether or not people who are vaccinated are getting more sick or less sick from the vaccination. Now, death, on the other hand, might be a little easier to calculate. They might be able to calculate how many people died that weren't vaccinated. And I've seen those numbers of how many people died that weren't vaccinated. The numbers I haven't seen is how many people were vaccinated, got COVID, and died. I haven't seen that data anywhere. So we need to compare the people who were vaccinated and died versus the people who were unvaccinated and died. And then we also have to compare all of the risk factors. And that data just doesn't exist. It doesn't. They don't have the data to make the claims that they're making. Pfizer doesn't have that data. And most of these studies that he's talking about that were peer-reviewed were funded and put on by the pharmaceutical industries. And typically, during normal processes, the FDA will do their own independent studies and their own independent tests to get the data. They didn't do that this time. They took the data that was provided to them from Pfizer's trials and they ran with it. They didn't do their due diligence to test these vaccinations. And it very well may be possible that these vaccinations are perfectly fine and everything worked well. But this scenario that they were under is completely different than every other scenario and every other drug that was approved for release to the public. This is not the same process that has happened before. It was outside of process and it wasn't done properly in terms of being able to prove their effectiveness of this vaccination. And this erodes the public trust in these institutions because these institutions are all the boy who is crying wolf. They're all lying. To some degree, they're lying, and they're eroding their trust. And once you erode trust, you're going to fuck with the population, and they're not going to be able to trust when something happens. Now, initially, I was kind of on board with a lot of the COVID measures because I was thinking COVID was going to be like a 5% mortality, but it's only like a 0.1% mortality or even lower. So not as many people are dying. I think like 2+ million people have died in the US out of a 300 million population, which is tragic, and that's a lot of people, but it's not as much as I was expecting or as it could have been. And once the FDA loses credibility, which in my opinion it fully has, it has fully lost credibility, then there's no defense mechanism against these corrupt pharmaceutical companies.
Right, you would never just trust technically you should never trust any company ever, unless you're hoping they're just trained by reputation. But like you would never just say like, oh well, we trust this company because it's, companies are good. You would say we trust the company to make a product, and then we have our government agencies, and then the peer review process that hopefully is a check on that product. That's like the goal, right?
Yeah, and I think our biggest difference between you and I is I view the FDA, the CDC, the NIH as all corporations that should also not be trusted.
Well, sure. You don't have to quote unquote trust them. You're just checking their incentives against each other, right? Like, for instance, like I don't trust, like if I was a third party.
Oh man, I should have interjected. I think I'm letting them talk because I felt I was interrupting too much. Checking their incentives against each other. The FDA and Pfizer totally had mutual incentives towards releasing a effective vaccination. There was incentives across the board for that vaccination to be the golden something, the shining golden vaccination that cured everybody, and it ended the pandemic, and it was glorious. Their incentive structures are aligned. So Pfizer's incentive structures are aligned for them to sell as much vaccination as possible, and the FDA's incentive structure is for Pfizer to sell as much vaccination as possible. The incentives for the FDA were not to determine whether or not this was safe. It was to get as many people vaccinated as possible with the assumption that it's safe. And that assumption was based off the data provided to the FDA from pharmaceutical industry testing and peer review. They didn't do their own peer review. It didn't go under the normal approval process. It went under the emergency authorization approval process. And I don't think I called him out on this. And he won in this instance because I wasn't quick-witted enough to get him.
I might say I don't trust the United States and I don't trust China. You cannot trust both of those people, but you would absolutely trust them to call each other out, right? So I might say like I don't trust the US and China. They're both liars. However, if the US does something and it's wrong, China will absolutely catch that because they're not gonna lie about everything, right? They would call out the United States if they thought they could expose a flaw in the US reason, right? That would be my thing.
Oh, see, he's wrong here too, and I didn't call him out. Damn, I'm terrible at this. China wants COVID to go away. All evidence suggests, not all evidence, most of the evidence suggests that COVID was developed in the Wuhan lab and it was released from there, and it was China's fault in coercion with the people that funded that lab. It was their fault, and so China wants this to go away. So if America is willing to lie about their vaccinations' effectiveness, COVID's totally fine with going along with that. It matches COVID. I can't even talk. China is totally fine with going along with that narrative because it matches China's incentives. The incentive for China is to make COVID go away, to say it wasn't their fault, to have everyone forget about this entire situation. That's what China wants. China doesn't want to be blamed for it. They don't want lawsuits. They want it to go away. So if Pfizer's going to say, we have a vaccination, it works well, this is going to go away, China's in lockstep. China's not going to call them out. Now, for the conspiracy theorists who don't believe we landed on the moon, China and Russia would call out America if America lied about landing on the moon, because there's no incentive for China and Russia to acknowledge that America beat them to the moon. But there is an incentive for China to lie about how bad COVID is, how long COVID's lasted, whether these vaccinations work. China totally has the incentive to go along with it. There's literally nobody to check to balance out the narrative by Pfizer. Nobody. The FDA doesn't do it. China won't do it. And there's no one to call out the FDA. There's no one to call out Pfizer because it's the FDA's job to call out Pfizer, but they're compromised. And that kind of tied into what I was talking about, Scientology catching the chemical imbalance thing. It's not Scientology's job to catch the chemical imbalance thing, but Scientology's mission is against the pharmaceutical industry. Much like Russia's mission was against America, so if America landed on the moon or faked the moon landing, Russia would call them out. So the pharmaceutical industry not necessarily faked, but they didn't have the proper evidence for a chemical imbalance, and they got called out by Scientology. But Scientology is a clown of an organization, and it should have been the FDA that did that, but the FDA didn't, because the FDA has been compromised.
So I might not trust necessarily like I don't have like maximum trust in the FDA or whatever, or maximum trust in the corporation, but the FDA's job is to do big trials and to make sure that like drugs have a certain safety threshold. So you would trust them to do that, or I would. I understand. I guess maybe you wouldn't, but yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't, because as we were talking about the false in one thing, false in all things, the FDA totally let that drug Metrix onto the market and it killed people. So they dropped the ball there, and the FDA, not the FDA, but yeah, the FDA. The FDA has dropped the ball so many times.
Well, hold on. You might. I'm not familiar with that you're talking about. That might be one example of the FDA dropping the ball. But in other examples, the FDA was better than the EMI. I forget what it's called in Europe, where they do drug approvals, because we caught I think thalidomide. Thalidomide. I don't know how it's pronounced. Which was something that I believe got approved in Europe that I think was like killing fucking babies or something, right? But in the United States it didn't get through as much. Or I don't think it was.
So he has a pretty good point here, but again, we have to measure the incentives. Was that drug created by a company in Europe? Was it going to be making Europe money? Did the European agency have incentives to allow that drug to go through that the FDA did not? I don't know anything about that drug. I should look it up to see if the incentives don't lie. But yeah, the FDA could have got it.
Approved in all the United States. So that's one example of a drug that we didn't approve. That got approved in Europe that was causing harm in Europe, I believe, and then we didn't. So I mean, like, I'm sure the FDA's not perfect. There's gonna be times when drugs get through that shouldn't, but. Or gay babies, birth defects, something, yeah.
Yeah, you cut out a little bit on my end.
But... Oh, sorry. What I'm saying is that there are drugs that the FDA hasn't approved that have been approved in other places in the world that were ultimately harmful. So I mean, in some places the FDA might drop the ball, in other places the FDA might do a better job than in Europe.
Yeah, and that's difficult on society, because as like CNN will create a fake news story about whatever, or Fox. I grew up through the Obama years, thanks Obama, so I saw Fox News lying over and over and over, and then I also saw CNN lying over and over and over again. So these institutions, not that Fox and CNN are institutions, but they kind of are. A lot of these institutions have been wrong on pretty large instances, which kind of erodes the trust in the FDA. And I would like to have maximum trust in our institutions, like you do, but I've seen.
Well, hold on. To be clear, I don't have.
I mischaracterized them so hard there. I shouldn't have said maximum trust. I just meant to say more trust, and I said maximum instead. And I mischaracterized his position because he doesn't have maximum trust in the institutions. He just has more trust than I do. And I think his trust is a little bit unfounded.
Not maximum trust. Like I think it's good to call them out and to be careful about them, and understanding they could be right or wrong at some points in time. I mean, really, all they have to do is beat random chance. But I mean, 51% isn't good. Yeah. The idea is that hopefully they're trying their best. They're probably going to make mistakes at some points, but it's better than trusting other people in media who have a whole bunch of incentives to lie in different ways that aren't necessarily in the interest of the American people without like a governmental check on them.
Yeah. I'm sorry for mischaracterizing your position. I didn't mean maximum trust. I just meant I wish I could trust the FDA as much as you trust the FDA.
Sure.
But because of all the things I've seen throughout our society of large corporations, large institutions lying for profit and, like, I guess, business clout.
Well, yeah, but like, aren't you kind of a product of a successful medical regulatory environment? Like you were able to get a kidney transplant. You're probably on some immunosuppressant drugs for quite a while. Like a lot of this stuff, the drugs that you're on were approved by the FDA. The procedures that you were put through to do the transplant and everything, all of that are probably overseen by some medical institution. I don't know if the FDA does that. Like, wouldn't you be an example of like a success story of that?
To some extent, but I've also had some pretty traumatic experiences from the failures of that. I got heparin poisoned and almost died in 2008. China released a bad batch of heparin to a large portion of the United States. And when you're on dialysis, they use heparin to thin your blood out. And I had a batch of bad heparin that wasn't caught by any of these institutions and almost died from that.
See, this is a bad pivot on me. I shouldn't have used that anecdotal evidence. I should have stuck with the FDA being compromised. So when the FDA approved most of these drugs, it was well before they were taking fees from pharmaceutical industries. When the FDA approved kidney transplants, when the FDA approved Prograft and Cellcept, the drugs I take, they were not 40% funded by the pharmaceutical industry. They weren't. And most of the drugs in use today, in circulation today, are very old drugs for when the FDA was a far more sound institution, as was our government. Our government and all of our institutions have been slowly eroding because of corporate greed and malfeasance, and as he was saying, monetary incentives. Their incentives have all gone to the monetary instead of the regulatory, and that's the avenue I should have went with. He totally won this exchange, and me getting poisoned by heparin doesn't really matter in this instance, and I kind of look like an idiot. I should have just focused on the FDA being compromised now, and it wasn't compromised then, because it is way more compromised now than it was in the past. And a lot of new drugs you get released are actually just kind of, they modify a tiny amount of things. They change the name so that they no longer have a generic. So let's say they have a blood pressure medication, they'll change like one little molecule and it works exactly the same as the old medication. They'll just slap a new name on it and then pimp that drug out so the old drug doesn't get used anymore. Not that I support ivermectin or for COVID or anything like that, but there was a lot of incentives for them to push down ivermectin because the drug is so old that no one's making money on it. It's not a profitable drug. They don't want people taking ivermectin because no one's making money. Now, if they released new prophylaxis, what they did, I think Merrick had the first one, things that reduce the symptoms of COVID, those would be new, and they can make buco dollars on it. So they're going to be supporting that significantly more than something like ivermectin, which doesn't make any money.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like, it might not be perfect, but like, absent these institutions, you would be dead 100%, right?
Oh yeah. I'm not a Luddite or an anti-advancement or any of that.
Sure.
I'm mostly just concerned about the ability of society to reject institutions because the institutions have proven themselves very capable of massive failures. And the internet allows those massive failures to get expanded in such a large degree that there's going to be swaths of people that are now anti-vax because of the handling of COVID. And I think that is like one of the worst situations we could be in as a country and a society.
Sure, but then, I mean, like, there are massive successes as well. You just have to balance it out. If you are unhappy with the system, not to do a nirvana fallacy here, but like, I'm curious, like, what are some alternatives or what are some changes that you would say should be made?
No, well, I definitely think they need to be more transparent with the research. They try to get the research to be released from Pfizer, and I think they try to say they'll release it in 150 years.
Isn't that like, I have to go and check, but like, in terms of like all the peer-reviewed research for like medical outcomes, my understanding is that information is all totally open. That whole like 150-year thing, I thought it was like very specific formulations of like a vaccine or whatever, that's not.
So what a lot of that data is the large pharmaceutical industries, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, they did their own trials and they did their own testing for safety and efficacy. And they did all this data and then they provided that to the FDA. And the FDA used the pharmaceutical industry's data and research, and they didn't do too much of their own independent data and research, which is why when they approved it, they didn't just approve it. They approved it under emergency authorization, which means they didn't have to take the same necessary steps to test the drug, to do their own safety protocols on the drugs like they normally would. And things could come up in those Pfizer trials that we should be able to see, but we can't get that data. They're not going to release that data for a long time. Court ruling happened where they have to like slow drip the data, and we'll be able to see some of that stuff in there. But regardless of whether or not we could see the data or if there's anything in the data, the fact that they're just not open with it, these pharmaceutical companies are not open with their research, with their testing, with their methodologies, and the fact that they're hiding it and they had lawyers fighting to not release it is shady. And I'm talking about trust in institutions, and hiding data is not a trust in an institution. And a lot of that kind of stuff. For instance, I work with databases. I know a lot about databases. One of the primary reasons I believe that the COVID came from the lab is the databases from the Wuhan lab of virology were deleted. They deleted the databases. They purged those databases. I've worked with databases for about 20 years. Never, ever, ever have I deleted a database. That just doesn't happen. You don't delete databases. You can archive them and put them on tape, or you can archive them and put them in backup. You never delete a database. The only time you delete a database is if you're trying to hide the data that's in that database. Obviously, this doesn't count for like building a new database and testing it or like non-important things. But a virology institution would never delete their database, and they did almost exactly when that virus became leaked. So that is very suspicious, and that's why I lean towards it being lab leaked, because I know about databases, and I know that a institution of virology would never delete a database unless they were hiding something.
Not like it's not information that has ever been released before necessarily like needs to be available to know like the safety factor or anything of any of these drugs released. I could be wrong. I'd have to look that up, but I saw that claim a few times.
Yeah, I think I disagree with you because of the way Project Warp Speed allowed Pfizer to do a lot of their own testing independent from other testing organizations to push that drug through a little bit faster.
I have to see specifically what Warp Speed did. I know obviously it's called Warp Speed. The goal was to make it a little faster, but I don't know if any of the safety steps were actually skipped over or not. Like they still.
The safety steps weren't necessarily skipped over, but the job of the testing was moved over from the FDA to the pharmaceutical companies. And this whole process is abnormal, so we should be very suspicious about everything that's happening during this entire thing.
Did the phase 3 trials and everything, right? Like.
Yeah, but in those phase 3 trials, they were pretty limited. For instance, I dug through and I tried to find the testing for kidney failure patients who had kidney transplants, but they only had 12 people that had end-stage renal disease, which is a little more broad than kidney transplant. End-stage renal disease encompasses people that haven't had a transplant and people that have had a transplant. That just means their kidney function is below a certain threshold. And there's only 12 of them in the initial study within the Pfizer mRNA vaccination. And for my particular bracket, that wasn't enough information. And then they didn't include a lot of the data that I would have liked to see in order to make an educated decision on whether or not to get vaccinated.
Gotcha. Is it generally a contraindication if you have renal failure to not get vaccinated? Is that ever?
Yeah, I'm not one of those dorks who's going to say their doctor told them not to get vaccinated. My doctor totally said, yeah, you should get vaccinated. And we had long conversations about the effectiveness of the vaccination. And he was like, you are the highest risk. You should get vaccinated the most. Your body is probably not going to create a good immune response to the vaccination. So you should get vaccinated and then have your antibodies tested to see if the vaccination took. And if it didn't, then you should get revaccinated or get a booster relatively quickly.
See, I don't know what he means by that word. I'm going to have to listen to it again and Google it. He got me here simply because I don't know what the hell he's trying to say.
To try to get your immune system up to scuff and to get it to actually grab onto that spike protein and incorporate that into your immune response.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious because like the idea of like I would have wanted to see more renal failure people tested, I guess, with the vaccine. I'm curious if having renal failure or having these types of complications are generally contraindications for getting.
Contraindication. I don't really understand what he's saying here. I should have just said outright that I didn't understand what he was saying, but I was trying to keep the flow. Let's see what contraindication, what Google pulls up for contraindication, what the fuck that means. Contraindication. What the fuck? Oh, it's one word. Anything, including a symptom or medical condition that is a reason for a person not to receive a particular treatment or procedure because it may be harmful. For example, a bleeding disorder is a contraindication for taking aspirin. Okay, yeah. No, kidney failure is not a contraindication for the vaccination. Obviously, I just talked about how my doctor recommended it. Yeah, not at all.
Vaccinated. Like it'd almost be like saying that like I wanted to get vaccinated, but I didn't see that they tested a lot of Star Wars: The Next Generation fans to see how well they.
I can't believe he did me dirty like that. To try to equivocate Star Wars: Next Generation fans with people who have kidney failure that's dirty. He did me dirty there.
Were vaccinated, so I decided not to get it. And I'm curious, like, is that like a contraindication for getting a vaccine as being a Star Wars: Next Generation fan? Because if it's not, I don't know why we want that particular data before going down that road.
I think for this particular instance it is because that spike protein was supposed to only be retained within the area where the shot was taken, but it was proven the spike protein was actually released throughout the entire body. So they found like that spike protein in women's uteruses, and they found the spike proteins in other parts of organs. And I am unsure what that spike protein is going to do in my transplanted kidney if that spike protein gets into my transplanted kidney with all of my immunosuppressant medications. Now,
yeah, but I mean, like, wouldn't you be worried then about like the much higher amount of that spike protein that would go through your body if you actually got a COVID-19 infection? Like.
Yeah, except for the fact that I wasn't in a high-risk category of getting the infection because I worked from home and I rarely left. I had all my food delivered and all that stuff. COVID was fantastic for my lifestyle as a cave goblin.
But but ultimately you still got it, right?
Yeah, my wife went.
Yeah, he did get me there. He got me there. But I should have came back with the fact that my wife is triple vaxxed, and she's the one who went out and got COVID and then brought it back to me. And since COVID, vaccination doesn't stop the spread, and it's not very effective, if effective at all, in reducing COVID, she was under the false sense of security that she was protected because she was vaccinated. So she took unnecessary risk in public spaces, caught COVID, and brought it back to me.
Went out to a bunch of parties, but I got it in December, and it didn't have much of an impact.
Sure.
And I'm not of the thinking that if I would have gotten vaccinated, anything bad would have happened. The odds are super low, and because of the way the internet projects things, you can have 10 people have a reaction to the vaccination out of 300 million people who took it, and then those 10 people are able to go on these alternative media sites or go on the internet and tell their story and make it seem like a lot more people are getting these adverse reactions than actually happen.
Sure.
And I think the function of small minority groups having a much larger voice than they actually represent has been exacerbated by the internet to such a degree that it might actually be like civilization ending, to be super hyperbolic. But you got these small factions with very loud voices able to skew messaging. Like, a lot of people think that the left is absolutely crazy or the right is absolutely crazy because a tiny sliver, like 1 to 5% of those groups, are super loud and get a lot of attention. But that's not what is the reality. We're not seeing reality on the internet for the most part.
Yeah, I don't think I necessarily disagree. Yeah.
Yeah. And so because reality is so hard to grasp, I think it's made people like myself highly skeptical about reported facts by institutions.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I can sympathize at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, anything else? Yeah. What else?
I could talk about stuff like this for a long time. Yeah, I think that's about it. You can talk about video games if you want more while you're playing this, but I don't want to steal all of your shine.
Okay. Well, yeah. You really didn't like Overwatch just because of the or not Overwatch. I'm sorry. You really didn't like XCOM just because of the Overwatch stuff.
So I have limited time. I work a full-time job, and then afterwards I kind of make videos on the internet under the consumer moniker. So when I game, it doesn't feel like it's going to be above an 8 out of 10 in my personal opinion. I drop it relatively quickly. So I gave XCOM about 2 hours, and it wasn't feeling like it was going to be an 8 out of 10 or above, so I drop it.
Gotcha.
Like I did not read. And because my time is more limited, I'd rather play a 10 out of 10 experience than an 8 out of 10. And I'm in a bucket where I make quite a good amount of money, though the price of a game never plays into a fact. So I'd much rather have these 10 out of 10 experiences cost like $300. I would have paid $300 to play Elden Ring, hands down. And so my spectrum of gameplay is a little different than a lot of other people's. I'm less forgiving for bad games.
Okay. People are wanting me to ask if you have a Reddit account called The Consumer.
Yeah, I've only posted twice. So I try to make a YouTube channel doing my own variation of movie reviews because I watch movies very differently than a lot of people as well. I was watching on my second monitor while I'm gaming. And some movies are good for a second monitor view, and some movies are not good for a second monitor view. So I try to categorize movies on, is this a good movie to watch passively or actively? And then I create...
Man, that rant was kind of out of nowhere. I'm realizing me paying more money for a game. What I meant to say is that XCOM is probably a good game, but I don't find it to be a 10 out of 10. And because I think I paid $50 for the game, I'm not going to continue to play the game because I paid for it, simply because I paid for it. I will pay $70 for a game, and if I'm not liking it after 2 hours, I'll just drop it completely. I'm not going to continue to play a game that I'm not having a 10 out of 10 experience on, or a 9 or an 8 out of 10. If I'm not having a good experience with the game, I will drop it. And I wasn't having a good experience with XCOM, so I dropped it. I don't know why I went on talking about I would pay $300 for Elden Ring. I think I was trying to prove the point that if it's a 10 out of 10 experience, that's the experience I want. So I'll forego an 8 out of 10 experience, regardless of anything, to chase after that 10 out of 10 experience. And I didn't do a very good job wording that.
I did this Path of Exile video where I removed all my sockets, and it got like 75,000 views, and I got all my subscribers from that one Path of Exile video, and it got blown up on Reddit. I don't use Reddit. So I logged into Reddit, created a Reddit account specifically to comment on people that were commenting on my video. That's all I've used Reddit for.
Gotcha. Okay, can I ask one more question?
You can ask as many questions as you want.
People really want me to ask about coprophagia.
Coprophagia? I don't know what that is.
Oh, about eating your own poop.
Oh, I don't know anything about that. I know you can eat cow shit. Cows have 5 stomachs, and they barely digest their grass as it comes out. So when a cow shits, it's mostly just grass. It's only like 20 to 30% digested. So if a cow really wanted to
apparently
eat its own
there's
shit,
a guy
it can eat its
called The Consumer who eats shit, and it's definitely gonna make me look like I eat shit, which does make me more interesting. I should have played
Shit.
I should have played
get a lot of
along with
nutrition
it.
out of that.
Wait, what is your Reddit account again?
It's like the consumer with a big cock on it. I've only
That wasn't very clear. Consumer with the big cock on it. So, oh. It's showing what I like on Reddit. I better move that away. The only time I go to Reddit is for WTSSTADAMIT. So let's go to Reddit. Good thing I'm not into anything weird. So this is my username, and apparently there's a different consumer. Mine's the consumer underscore 8 dash 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 D, and there's a different consumer that eats shit. Immediately after this, I tried to find it, but I come up. I don't know what this is. Maybe it is this. No. So if anyone knows this consumer shit eater, the consumer shit eater, then it just gets the dung eater. So I want to know what they're talking about. So I have a way to navigate when people think I'm a shit eater, but I can't find it.
only posted like 3 times. Let me go to Reddit and see.
Or I mean, how did you spell consumer?
Give me just a second. I spelled it. Oh, I don't know how to use Reddit. Reddit is so confusing to me as a boomer, as a 40-year-old man who doesn't go to Reddit. I will paste it in chat. I made it. So I'm probably the most immature 40-year-old on the planet. I'll just post it in YouTube chat. There you go. It's and because it has the 8 dash 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 D, it's really hard to find.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so it's hard to explain my immature 8 dash 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 D at the end of the consumer. I probably shouldn't have done that, but the consumer was taken, and then a bunch of like consumer 125 was taken, consumer 5, 6, 7, 8 was taken. So I said, fuck it, I'm gonna make an 8 dash 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 D because I'm a very mature 40-year-old who acts in that way.
Gotcha. There's a Reddit account called The Consumer. It's spelled correctly, and that guy talks about eating shit, I think. So that's what everybody wanted to know.
Oh, yeah, no, that's not me. I think my YouTube is at The Consumer. It's a terrible name. I consume a lot of media, and I wanted to start my channel talking about all the media I consume. I play a lot of video games, I watch a lot of TV shows, I watch a lot of movies. In 2002, I worked at Blockbuster, so I got infinite free movies. So I've been watching movies for a very long time and watching TV shows for a very long time. So I have a very wide knowledge on this that I wanted to partake to the world just as like a side project.
Okay.
And it got co-opted, and I got pigeonholed into Path of Exile content. So what would be your recommendation? Because you have a very successful channel where you can talk about anything you want and you can do anything you want.
He does have the channel I want. He's fucking playing Triangle Strategy, and people are actually watching him play Triangle Strategy. Anybody else throws on Triangle Strategy, everybody's gone. I play Zelda, 0 people are watching. I play Path of Exile, I get like 15 to 20 on a good day. So I do want my channel to be more than Path of Exile. And he says I got to branch out. So here I am reviewing my performance on Destiny's stream as part of my channel.
And people come to see Destiny. You're not pigeonholed into a specific type of content, but it seems like YouTube very much tries to pigeonhole people down the most niche category. So because my channel blew up with Path of Exile, anything I post that isn't Path of Exile gets no visibility and no views. Not that my videos have high quality or anything like that, and they should be getting views, but what would be your recommendation? Should I create multiple channels?
I mean, the goal is like it just depends on the style of channel that you run. Like typically people can become interested because you're providing like good content about a topic, so they'll watch you for that topic.
I'm not going to be providing good content on a topic.
Or people will start to become more interested in you as a personality because they like the way that you explain things or they like your personality. But you have to
And I don't think people like who I am as a person or my personality. Sounds like I'm kind of fucked.
start branching out pretty quickly, or you need to branch out if you want people to follow you for other stuff. Otherwise, people just know you for the one thing that you're known for, and they don't really care about anything else. So if you did like a year of Path of Exile videos, and then try to do other content, people be like, I don't know if I care about this as much.
Yeah, that's exactly what has happened. Most of my content is actually Path of Exile. But like 8 months before I did Path of Exile, I did nothing but movie reviews. I'm talking about that. I talk about woke. I want to talk about woke real quick. People have no idea what woke is. There's a lot of shows that have a diverse cast that are not woke. I watched a movie called Bodies, Bodies, Bodies.
Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I love that movie. It's the most Gen Z movie ever, and the language in it is so far outside of my lexicon. They're totally talking Gen Z language, and a lot of people would probably think Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is woke because of the way they talk. They say, like, are you triggering me? But it's not woke at all because it totally fits the theme of the movie. It's thematic. Let's see what I say about what is woke. See if I got it right.
It was the most Gen Z movie I've ever seen. I loved it, and it had a very diverse cast, and I didn't feel that it had one woke thing within that entire movie, despite it looking woke and sounding woke. But a prime example of something that is woke is something that feels like the movie was made, and then someone came in and said, we need XYZ in this movie in order to ship it. So they altered the movie to put that in. And the prime example of an altered movie to put something in that is woke is the final Avengers movie. What was that called? Avengers? Endgame. And a lot of people may instantly think it's the girl power moment where the 5 girl superheroes line up. But I don't even think that's that woke. I think a lot of girls would be, that's just like a girl power moment. And I don't view a girl power moment as woke. I think a lot of young girls or a lot of young kids might have enjoyed that moment, and that's probably what that was for. But there's a scene in Endgame where Captain America is in a support group, and they just happen to have a gay guy in that support group. And that was only thrown into that movie to have a gay guy in Endgame. And that
Wait,
is
am I
it.
crazy? When was this? I just don't remember at all. But
Perfect. You shouldn't have remembered. It had nothing to do with the story. And so Captain America was just in the support group for no reason. And in that support group, there's a guy talking about how his husband got blinked away, and he's like crying about it, and it just doesn't fit.
The support. I'm thinking like tactical support or whatever. But you mean like Alcoholics Anonymous support, like at the beginning of the movie. I remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why the hell is Captain America there?
Was he there because he needed support, or was he trying to help other people? I don't remember.
No, he was there so they can ham fist a gay person into Endgame.
Huh. Okay.
So that's how I view woke, and I try to identify that in TV shows because a lot of people just have no clue what woke means or what woke is. And for me, woke is the subversion of art for politics.
Interesting. I feel like that's a really broad descriptor. You could fit a lot of things in there, but
It's not that broad of a descriptor. Something that is woke is taking an art form and then is taking modern day ideologies or I forgot what I even said. They're subverting the art to fit a particular propagandistic narrative. And it can go on both sides. I haven't really seen any red pill wokeness in a movie, but let's say they created Avengers Endgame, and instead of Captain America being at this support group, and instead of there being like a gay guy, like Andrew Tate's in there, and it's not a comedic effect, and Andrew Tate drops like an Andrew Tate message, some kind of red pill message, that would be just as woke because it doesn't belong in the movie. It has nothing to do with superheroes being Avengers. It didn't belong. The only reason that scene is in that movie is so that someone at Marvel can say, yeah, we have gay representation in this movie. And that's the only reason that's in there. Now, someone else talked about how the dude with the wings was a part of a support group. I don't know what they're talking about. If that support group is part of the narrative of Avengers and that support group plays a large role within the story, I don't remember that, and if it does, then it's not woke, and I need to find a new woke example. But something that is woke is taking something that doesn't belong and putting it in the movie to fit a narrative that they need to fit. For instance, the movie Bros. I haven't seen it, but I think it's about 2 gay guys dating in New York. The gay stuff in Bros is not woke at all. Bros is probably not a woke movie. The whole movie is about that culture. So everything that happens in that movie is about that. So it's not going to be woke simply because it has 2 gay guys in it. Now, what would be woke in Bros is if in Bros they threw in like an anti-capitalistic narrative or something like that, something that didn't belong in Bros, but whoever makes the movies or some kind of DEI inclusion requirement, and they just tossed it in. Like Bros is playing, and all of a sudden it cuts away to they could have done trans, right? If they ham-fisted in a trans scene into the movie Bros, that could totally be woke. They're specifically pandering to a particular market for a specific agenda, for a specific reason, and that is woke. There's a TV show called Schitt's Creek, and one of the characters in it is gay, and he's from New York. It totally fits. It's not woke at all. There's nothing woke about that. There's so many movies that have a diverse cast, that has representation, that aren't woke. But there's also movies that don't need that representation, that don't need that diverse cast, and that representation and that diverse cast gets ham-fisted into the movie simply so they can say it's there. For example, The Little Mermaid, I haven't seen it yet, but The Little Mermaid being black isn't woke. Race swapping isn't really woke. A lot of people are doing it because it's woke, but you could tell a perfectly fine Little Mermaid story if Ariel is woke. But what is woke is modifying the art, modifying the narrative to make Ariel a girl boss who don't need a man and can save herself. In the original, Eric works with Ariel to take down Ursula, and Eric plays a role to protect Ariel, and he turns the boat and stabs Ursula. But in the modern version, I saw Critical Drinkers YouTube video about it. They removed any heroicism out of Eric and gave it all to Ariel, because part of that woke agenda is that women are all powerful. They can do everything and they don't need a man. So they changed the art form of Ariel to fit modern audiences. And that is what's woke. I believe they had a Cinderella with, I think, Brandy, and Brandy was black in the Cinderella, but that movie wasn't woke at all. It was just a black Cinderella. There's nothing wrong with the black Cinderella. There's nothing wrong with a black Ariel. But when you change the story of Cinderella, you change the story of The Little Mermaid, you put something that didn't belong or that doesn't belong in the art form specifically to pander towards a specific target audience or to pander towards some type of political ideology or agenda or propaganda. That is what woke is.
Because
I don't think.
I mean, I think there was a reason. I think I would fight on that. Fuck, hold on. I'm trying to. My memory's coming back to me. I feel like I would fight a little bit on that because wasn't the point to establish in the beginning that the whole world is kind of grieving, that a whole bunch of people are gone, and there's probably heroes that are grieving too, that like people are gone, and that's just like an easy scene to show that like Captain America is everybody else is, and then the guy talks about like my husband got blinked out. Like,
I think we'll just have to disagree on that. I don't feel that that was a good.
Yeah, that movie was super long. That whole scene wasn't needed in there. And we didn't know who that character was. If they wanted to talk about the grief of people being blinked out, they could have taken a character that was in previous movies and having them have someone who was lost. The only reason that scene is in the movie is to say that they have gay representation inside of the Avengers.
Good way to represent that the world was in turmoil because a lot of people were blinked out. I don't think it makes sense that Captain America is in this random support group of people who got blinked out. You had a very poignant example in The Last of Us Season 3 on why that scene wasn't woke.
The Last of Us. Episode 3, right?
Episode 3, that was with the Overman, Keith Overman, and the other guy, and they were gay together. Well, I don't even know if they were. I don't know if they were gay. I can't remember. But it shows.
They
okay,
they were gay. They were gay. Yeah.
Okay. It shows the desolateness of the environment that two people come together, and even if they weren't gay, they might have just been so desperate for human affection and human love and human connection that that's where that turned out to. And I think in that moment, it didn't impact the art or the vision of the project at all. It amplified it because of the fact that these two people. It's almost like a love is love kind of story. They were together and they meant everything to each other. And the reason they meant everything to each other is because of the world they lived in. Everything was gone. Everything was desolate. And they were everything to each other. And I think making it a man-on-man situation made it more poignant. It gave it more punch than if it was a man and a woman. And you pointed that out on your stream several months ago. And I thought that was...
Did I say it gave it more punch than if it was a man or woman? I don't know if I said that. I mean, I just thought...
You said... it was a long time ago. You said something along those lines. I'm loosely interpreting your interpretation of like it not being woke.
I definitely I didn't think it was woke at all, but sure.
Yeah. And then there's an example within that Lois and the new Superman that's way worse than Smallville. I think it's episode 11. Lois is back in time in like the early 90s, and she goes on this rant, and it's just a packaged woke message talking about the crime levels in underserved minority communities. And it's just like a throwaway 30-second line that doesn't belong in the movie. And it was even like a flashback that they put specifically in the movie just to say that phrase.
Okay. I'm nodding, but I've never seen it, so I can't say anything about it. But
yeah. Anyways, that was part of what I wanted to do on my YouTube channel, because a lot of people say dumb shit about what is woke and what isn't woke. And for me, it's just culture, modern day culture, infusing itself into art forms to fit the current message that they want to promote.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This dude is totally done talking with me, and I have overstayed my welcome by
I'll bounce out
several minutes. I should have bounced a long time ago. I wasn't able to see his face as I was talking, so I wasn't able to read the social cues as well as in I should fucking go. Nobody here wants me here. Yeah, that fucking sucks.
Much enjoy watching you play strategy role-playing games. My favorite genre. Best of luck in the game.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Have fun. Be careful. Okay.
Later.
Bye.
Yeah. So I flubbed the hell out of that for performance there. I didn't get hardly any of my ideas out here properly. I give myself a 4 out of 10 on this showing. Highly doubt I'll be back. I am probably permanently banned from being pulled in again, and I don't blame him. But that was my appearance on Destiny's stream. He said I should branch out to expand my channel's horizons. So here I am branching out. Now, to be perfectly clear, I am a fan of Destiny. I don't agree with about 20% of his takes, but I do think he's able to use his brain properly, and he's not broken. He's a part of the left, but he's a part of the left because he has the ideas that the left has in his own mind that he came to through his own thought processes, through his own life experience, and through everything else. Other people are on the left because they're told to be on the left, and they're just following a crowd. They're a part of the sheeple of people. And the same is true for people on the right. But he's able to diverge from his group when he disagrees with his group. He's able to disagree with his group, and he's willing to put himself out there. And that takes a level of bravery that not a lot of people have. He's essentially the Neville Longbottom of the left. Neville Longbottom had to stand up to Harry, Hermione, and Ron as they broke the rules, and that showed a level of bravery that is significantly higher than standing up to your enemy. It's super easy to stand up to your enemy. Really easy. He's your enemy. You don't like that guy. You can stand up to him super easy. It's really hard to stand up to a friend, especially one who has either a lot of power or you respect, to stand up to them and say, dude, what you're doing is wrong. This is wrong. It takes a level of bravery that's higher than standing up against people you disagree with. And Destiny's ability to disagree with his leftist cohorts is admirable. And I think out of all the people I've seen on the left, David Pakman, people at the Young Turks, Lasan, I guess H3. Now, I don't think H3 is on the left. He's just a fucking moron. But that guy, I would say Vosh, but Vosh is on his own juice. Not that I watch a lot of Vosh, but he's on his own juice. I think Lasan is just an idiot. I think Vosh is also an idiot, but I don't think Destiny is an idiot. He's not as smart as I am. I mean, come on now. He had a home field advantage, and I was at work getting pinged, but he's pretty intelligent. I don't want this to seem like a negative interaction or anything like that. But fuck Destiny.